Afternoon, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. My name is Dave Peterson. I'm the director of the Africa program here at the National Endowment for Democracy. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. I think this should be quite an exciting discussion. The title of the meeting today might suggest that we're really talking about some technical aspects of implementation of the Kenyan Constitution and maybe the mechanics of CSO involvement with that. But the fact is that we're actually going to be addressing, I think, some very fundamental political and even philosophical issues in terms of Kenya's democratic trajectory. We'll be starting out with Kwame Owino, who's the CEO of the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is really, I think, one of the strongest NGOs in Kenya, longtime partner of the Center for National Private Enterprise. Kwame will be, I think, talking about the devolution and why it's important, as well as some of the challenges and prospects and the role of civil society. And then we'll have Vukasin Petrovic, who is my counterpart over at Freedom House, in charge of the Africa program there. And he'll be giving us some analysis of what's at stake with the constitutional implementation and devolution, as well as the role of civil society. But I think he'll be looking not just at Kenya, but the implications for what's happening in Kenya for the entire region, if not the continent. I think Kenya, as we all know, is really a trendsetter for East Africa. It's got one of the most developed economies, one of the most sophisticated political cultures. It's a key U.S. ally, and so really what's happening there is very important for what happens in the rest of the region. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Kwame. I think he'll have a PowerPoint presentation for us. I suspect that the meeting today is on Twitter. Don't know what our Twitter, NED Democracy. Okay, and if you could turn off or silence your cell phones too, that'd be appreciated. I think we'll sit down so that people can see that.
Go up there. Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for the kind introduction. I'm Kwame Owino. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a think tank based in Nairobi, in Kenya. The IE is 20 years old this year in May, and part of the ideas behind its formation were actually political changes. So we're actually the product of a momentous political event in Kenya. A number of professional Kenyans in the year 1992 foresaw the need to harness the voices of professionals to carry forward debates that would drive both political and economic reforms, because as you may all recall, in 1992, Kenya reverted to multi-party democracy. So they saw that opportunity because for a very long time, I think there was the understanding, or rather in a closed political and economic environment, policy monopoly. Rather, there's a monopoly of policy knowledge in the public sector. So the opportunity to actually bring balance to that environment by establishing the Institute of Economic Affairs, and obviously it started as a forum to discuss and present to the public sector and to government that. So here we are. There are 18 of us, 19 of us there, besides myself, and we work in 4 broad policy areas: international trade and public finance and management. We have a decentralization program, and one on economic regulation. Now, so here we are. I'll spend about 15-20 minutes just going through what's happening in Kenya today, a background about the Constitution, and what I see as the role of civil society in Kenya in, in this environment. So in terms of outline, we all know about the elections. Was itself not necessarily an event, but it was an important one because of 2007. I'll talk about the post-election environment. And then I'll try and isolate some stories around the politics and economics of devolution in Kenya today and over the last 1 year. I'll conclude with what I think is a state of play that's in flux. Then I'll try and talk about what the role of CSOs are. And I'm advised, because CSOs are not necessarily all a homogeneous group. I think especially in Kenya, there are 50 opinions over every one thing, which is both a good thing and in some ways can be frustrating for people who make decisions. Then I'll conclude very quickly. Now, I think the elections in 2013, in March 2013, was very, very important, and many people looked at it, partly because everybody was wondering whether lightning would strike twice. As you all know, in 2007, we had elections that everybody thought was going to be peaceful. Everybody took their eyes off the road. We had the lowest number of elections observers since Kenya reverted to multi-party democracy. Everybody believed Kenya had made it. Of course, the surprise was a different one. So now in 2013, definitely there was quite some anxiety about whether this would repeat itself, in addition to other difficult political debates around the ICC, around a new constitutional implementation and all that. So basically we had two contending groups. The elections were held, largely peaceful. Then of course there was the appeal to the Supreme Court, and this was also solved within a 3-4 weeks period, and I think we had a new administration. So basically we had a new administration by the end of April 2013, not 2014, sorry, should have corrected that. What was doubted from the beginning was whether this team, the new team, and I'm talking about by the new team, I mean the president and the deputy president, because that's the significant change that we had, really were supporters of devolution. There was no doubt at all that President Kenyatta had been in President Kibaki's team during the referendum in 2010 in August, and he supported President Kibaki's team, of course, which definitely drove forward, together with Mr. Odinga, the new constitution. Devolution was a big point, and it was one of the deal breakers for the constitutional moment. I think if there's one thing that all Kenyans had their heads wrapped around, or let me say a majority of their Kenyans, was, look, we need a constitutional change for the purposes of devolution and decentralization. I think a very highly, what people call the imperial presidency and the executive that dominated everything in Nairobi was something that Kenyans wanted to be broken. On the other hand, we had Deputy President William Ruto, who actually campaigned very, very, I think his first campaign, to be honest, was about, he was opposed to the constitution for various reasons. And so right from the outset, people asked, look, we have a mixed team here. Would this journey towards devolution continue? There was also the difficult relationship with the bureaucracy, and I'm talking about the bureaucrats in the public sector in Kenya, who largely did not think the constitution would pass, and many of them who were completely opposed to it, though they spoke in soft tones. The constitution passed overwhelmingly. I think 68% of those who voted actually supported it. But there's been the thinking among the observers of this process that Kenya's bureaucracy would try as much as is possible to delay, even frustrate the constitutional reform process. One, because it definitely transferring powers from one arm of government, the executive, towards the legislature and and of course the judiciary. So I think there was a watch and see. Now, on the post-elections, I think one of the things that is salient right now in Kenya is basically the subtle hints that have begun to be sent around. Among them is that because of the new constitutional dispensation, new offices were created, and all these commissions and independent offices, that all those have loaded into government new costs of government. Of course, it is completely false, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have traction. A budget was passed last year. Of course, in terms of basic constitutional requirements, a lot of things didn't go right. They were very late. There's a contention between the two houses of the legislature, but nevertheless, a budget was passed. A record budget in nominal terms, 1.6 trillion Kenya shillings, which is close to about $40 million. One of the largest budgets in that $14 billion, one of the largest budgets in that part of the world. I think President Kenyatta's administration received a very, very important boost in the early days, very, very important one, which was basically the VAT, value-added tax law, which was a major tax reform question over 20 years, which had never been seen. And it passed really, really quickly. There's the expectation that there'd be a fight between the executive and the legislature. No such thing happened. I think it rolled over and it passed very, very quickly. Of course, it's now being revised after the legislature realized that while this passed, I think the public was very unhappy because it extended taxation. What it did was reduced the exemptions that had existed for value-added taxes, but now what it brought down was that it expanded the base of taxation too widely that it immediately affected cost of living. There was also a standoff in the legislature. This is specifically regarding devolution. Why? Because under the Division of Revenue Bill, which splits revenue between the national government and the county governments, national governments and the county governments, it's supposed to be passed by both houses of parliament. And so there was a difference. There was actually a big debate between let me say, an absence of agreement between the Senate, who were the 47, well, they're more than that, about 63 members of the National Assembly who were elected to represent counties, and the National Assembly who represent the smaller constituencies. There's a difference, a big, big difference about the numbers. The National Assembly tended to accept Treasury's version. I think this also reflects the political structure in Kenya in the sense that the National Assembly has a majority of members of parliament from President Kenyatta's party and the coalition. While, on the other hand, what is supposed to be the minority party in the National Assembly, representing the coalition on CORD, which is basically the other coalition that contested the elections, has a majority in the Senate. So they're supposed to come together in a joint commission to discuss this. Nevertheless, I think with the support of the Treasury and the executive, as I saw it, they rolled this through. So this thing went to the Constitutional Court, but nevertheless, they passed it. So the standoff, which was a very political event, didn't have any consequence. Well, it had consequences, but 1 year later, when the Supreme Court actually affirmed the rights of the Senate to be heard, and actually for a joint commission to be put together. It has happened this year. It's ongoing now in Nairobi from last week, from Tuesday rather, which is a good thing. But again, the Supreme Court saves the Senate once more. So that standoff existed, and I think there's still some tension between the two houses of the legislature. So the result of that was that Treasury and the National Assembly carried the day in terms of what allocations would be provided for the counties, in terms of the splitting of revenues between the national governments and the county governments, a majority, of course, staying with the national government. So let's go now to the politics and economics of devolution. And I have some points here which I hope to spin into some coherent story. One of the things that passed because devolution was such an important thing was that when the Constitution passed and a task force was put together to try and bring in devolution in anticipation of the elections in 2013, a bill was passed by the 10th Parliament, the one that preceded this, and what they called it was the Transition to Devolved Government Act, and a series of other laws whose purpose was basically to phase in devolution over time, because the Constitution has established a 5-year time frame over which this is supposed to roll in. Among the things it created is what is called a transition authority. And the transition authority is supposed to put together some kind of time frame and to phase in this. The transition authority, I think it lost momentum. In my view, it did not assess right the politics, and therefore things began to happen, and obviously it was superseded. Members of when the governors were elected, the 47 governors, which each represent the counties, were elected, because of the fight over money, or they anticipated the fight over money and resources, they wanted the devolution and the devolved functions to be given to them as quickly as is possible. So they began to put pressure on the executive, and in particular, President Kenyatta. And in a meeting with them, he said, okay, fine, if that's what you want, then we will transfer those functions immediately. So all those functions are supposed to have been transferred. Nevertheless, I'm not too sure whether this is a conspiracy or not, but nevertheless, the Treasury and the bureaucracy in the executive had other ideas. It is very, very clear. I mean, this is basically a classical public choice question, which is, if the president accedes to the transfer of functions, immediate transfer of functions, it means staff and resources have to move immediately. No departments of government in Kenya want to countenance that. So here began the slow but very purposeful frustration of devolution. So that government is speaking from two sides. I mean, president says, look, I've transferred all those functions, but the money and the staff that's supposed to come with that does not come. And the confusion started. So what most governors did is as they have new money, or rather some little money, they began to employ, put in new staff, because staff isn't coming from up there, put in new staff, and of course this overwhelms their wage budgets. I've talked about that presidential directive. Whether the presidential directive was actually itself constitutionally valid is debated among lawyers. I think there's a middle ground. It's possible that presidential directive working with the transition authority could have actually got it. But anyway, that's it. Now, how did Parliament go about that? Or rather, how did the Treasury and the bureaucracy go about this? And Treasury is central to this question because of the resources. Kenya's Treasury, for a very, very long time, had a hold on public resources in a way that actually could frustrate or even enable public functions to be performed efficiently or not by simply withholding the money. So how did they go about it? They went about it in a way that we dispute in the Institute of Economic Affairs, but many people think is the fairest way to go given the circumstances, which is, they said, look, given the functions that have been transferred, they used historical costs to transfer, to cost those functions, and therefore transferred money based on what the functions they would have performed are. So for instance, when health facilities were, which is a requirement of the Constitution, are transferred to county governments, what the Treasury did was simply to say, look, last year we spent this proportionate amount to run these health facilities. Because these health facilities have therefore been transferred to counties, you will only receive the equivalent of what it would have taken to transfer that. Now that's a clever argument, it's very difficult to beat, but I think it's not valid for one or two reasons. One, historical costs take account of the fact that hold historical costs as sacred. The Constitution does not say anything. The only thing Kenya's Constitution provides is that at least 15% of ordinary revenues, which is the revenues coming from taxes, consumption taxes, and income taxes, at least 15%. So it's a ratchet. What it seems the costing, in costing the Treasury considered was that, look, while the Constitution requires us to give at least 15%, we have provided more than that, and therefore we've actually favored you. It came down to about 23, 24%, I think much later to about 26%. So looking as if we definitely met the technical requirements, when the appropriate question should have been, given the plans that you have, and overall, how should money, public money, be spent and split between national government and the county government, which in my view has a technical element but is largely a political question about what are the priorities that the country will rally around, as opposed to hamstringing counties with historical costs, which some of them may have held illegitimate, and which is actually part of the reason that drove that debate. So it's unresolved, but I think the costing function is still one. One of the other things that happened, the biggest service in Kenya, public service in Kenya that was devolved, education remained a function of national government, so national government still holds schools at all levels, colleges, high schools, and primary schools, which has 22% of budget expenditure every year. So basically the biggest second service is healthcare. And for healthcare, one of the things that the Constitution anticipated was that all health facilities, with the exception of what are called national referral hospitals, and there are only three, two teaching hospitals and one that deals specifically with research and spinal injury. Now, what happened was the ministries of health and departments of health went about reclassifying facilities for the same reasons. So downgrading others, reclassifying facilities as referral. And the point about that was then that money would actually have to be kept up within the ministry. So a lot of the jostling here and there, some of it not entirely in good faith, continued to happen. So this redefinition of facilities. And right from the beginning, there was therefore a clash between what the governments, or rather the county governors who run counties, and the executive, and in particular the Treasury had. So that conflict remains unresolved. I think there was a conference last week. But in general, how you define those roles is one of the things, one of the outstanding things in Kenya's. So I've highlighted some of those. It's not everything, obviously, including some comments that I've made in addition to, I think, an assertiveness in the part of governors. Many of them started to fly flags, which so depressed some members of parliament that the National Assembly passed a bill a couple of weeks ago saying that it is it's an offense in Kenya today for anybody to fly the national flag on a vehicle unless you're the president of the country, which is absolute nonsense, but, well, the law has passed, and I think there should be some constitutional reference over time to push it back to the dustbin where that law perhaps rightfully belongs. But the state of play today. I think Kenyans are concerned. Governors haven't behaved well as well. I mean, some of them haven't spent their money well. They've spent most of their money in conferences and stuff, and some of them have traveled. They traveled to Canada. I think some of them have even come to the States, visiting various states, and spent quite a lot of money on travel. Some of them have started a number of very expensive projects and everything else. One of the things that has happened is that there's been a big movement to revise the constitution for two reasons. One, the idea that has been sent out very clearly to Kenyans, and I think it's gaining traction with Kenya's media, and critically, was that the constitutional experiment regarding devolution is becoming too expensive. For that reason, we need to revise the constitution to do two things. One, because there's too much representation. So members of the National Assembly, out of their angst that the Supreme Court actually asserted the rights of the Senate to determine budget policy, one, at the radical moment are trying to abolish the Senate, which is, I mean, in terms of political theory, not possible. You can't have devolution without a Senate, because the senators represent the devolved units. At the radical extreme, on the other hand, are actually trying to merge the 47 counties into whatever number, starting from, you hear numbers from 8 all back to 15. My thinking is it's a bit too late to do that. This is something that should have happened much, much earlier with the constitutional moment. And the Constitution has very high thresholds for its amendments that I do not think they would achieve, in addition to the fact that, of course, governors are already in place, and that's not going to happen very easily. The president stated last week that it's too early to revise the Constitution. I think some of his lieutenants, though, and some of his cabinet colleagues had actually wanted the Constitution revised. So, again, I think they've responded to what they see as the public's and the broad, it would be very politically costly to actually get a referendum and actually attempt to revise the Constitution. It's not a popular thing among those who know it. One governor was impeached a while back, and the impeachment of a governor is basically something that happens through the Senate. The Senate in Kenya has rights to hear and impeach a governor entirely for procurement questions, spent money wrongly, a gentleman with a lot of public service behind him, but spent money wrongly, approved certain expenditures that are ridiculous, and he's been impeached, he's gone to court. So obviously this is still a matter in court and will be probably decided in the next few months. But what concerns someone like myself is the glee with which the senators actually took upon this job. It's as if, look, we caught them. And it's not entirely dispassionate. I think it's become a question of settling scores, and many governors are rightfully concerned. So there's a Supreme Court decision that is being awaited regarding, of course, impeachment. I think that's ongoing as well. But I think among the good things is that right now devolution has pace, and I think everybody knows that it's not going anywhere soon, because there's a joint sitting by the legislature, and they've actually accepted that by the two joint speakers to sit and revise these questions as they become, I mean, the contentious points come out. In this has been thrown the wage bill debate, which is basically that Kenya's wage bill, the total wage bill, public expenditure on wages as a proportion of GDP, proportion of national revenues, is one of the highest on the continent. I think almost 4 or 5 percentage points higher than any comparable country. And obviously it has to be brought back in. I think, as usual, many other people in civil society and all the other sides see this as coming too early, and it's supposed to constrain, or rather, to claw back on the gains that devolution have made. I don't believe that, because as the Institute of Economic Affairs, we've seen wage growth in Kenya growing at much faster rates than revenues. I think the average in sub-Saharan Africa is 7.5%, 7.5% of GDP. In Kenya's case, it's about 11.5, almost 12. 5% of GDP is not small change. I think there's something that needs to be done. In addition to the fact that there's this Salaries and Remuneration Commission, one of the independent commissions whose work is basically to bring the wage bill under control. So they've started this work, and I think. There's been corruption at county levels. Not that corruption is necessarily a preserve of counties, but I think the press has also hyped, partly because the public expectation about the performance of counties was so high, and some county governors and some of them have performed so poorly that it's been disappointing. So in that kind of backlash, everybody wants governors and counties to be punished for one reason or the other. And you see in Kenya's press, I think many people saying, look, we should have kept the old constitution and all stuff like that. So it's just that disappointing, and some of that action is really visceral. I'll talk quickly, because my time is up, about the role of CSOs. Many CSOs see themselves as protectors of devolution, as they define it. And so basically, taken on the role of protectors of devolution, and I think are out there looking for conspiracy theories and conspirators who are trying to derail the devolution project. So you'll see all manner of discussions. I think many of them are doing a lot of work at county levels. I think the value of that work will be visible soon, but many of them have provided quite a lot of assistance to counties in terms of helping them. I mean, the IE as well helped some counties. They did a very poor job in terms of capacity doing, because there's a huge requirement under public finance laws for every county to develop a fiscal strategy paper and all that. And they do not have capacity, so most of them did a really, really bad job. They asked for some assistance here and there. And over time, I think it'll get better. Some have provided training and capacity development in terms of dealing with the members of the county assemblies. Some of them troubleshooting and providing some assistance, basically like some brain trust assistance for specific governors who are more outgoing than others. They've also continued to provide county level oversight, including some of our partners. I mean, a gentleman sitting here, Lars, has met some of them, basically trying to provide county level oversight. Our theory at the Institute of Economic Affairs is that counties will not be dysfunctional entirely because they choose. Some of the inefficiencies that we see at national level will be reproduced at county level, because the public infrastructure for public finance management in general and public sector performance is the same. So it's basically the same thing that's probably happening. So county level oversight, I think, is required, just to point out things, participate in what the public finance laws require, which is the county budget and economic forums. They're supposed to be put together by the governors. Some didn't have an idea about how to institutionalize them. They've received some assistance. And obviously, again, in the performance of counties, it's a checkered board. I mean, not everybody is done well and in all that. So some are definitely much further ahead than others. CSOs have continued, and I think this is a role they must continue to perform, which is to provide pressure for government, rather the executive, and the legislature to insist on functional assignments to be done. Basically, the distribution of roles. Because it's one thing for the presidential directive to come out and say, look, you have all those roles assigned, but the money does not suggest that those roles are respected. Or the discussion doesn't come out in that. So I think that pressure is required, and I think it's an imperative at this moment in time. I think one other thing that CSOs are doing, I chose just a few that I think we are more familiar with, is basically a definition of public participation. Kenya's constitutional infrastructure has provided a very, very wide a principle of public participation, but nobody knows how to give it structure and actually to define it. So this is an opportunity for CSOs actually to come out and say, look, in what circumstances and how do we ensure that public participation has meaning? I think it will continue to be something that's redefined as we go ahead, but providing meaning to public participation, even facilitating, for those who have the resources and the time, facilitating that public participation is important. Governors are overwhelmed. I think they have a lot of stuff to do, and they don't know what to do. Some are really anxious that, look, if the public have to come and ask me questions. It's one thing, I think, to campaign. Some of them received as much as 800,000 votes, but it's yet another. Finally, as I conclude, I think the general conclusion among CSOs is devolution and constitutional implementation is endangered. And my view is there's no crisis yet. But if you see the unconnected and cluttered thinking here and there, you may think that actually may happen. The harbingers of Kenya's constitutional dispensation will actually be the courts. And so the courts are worth watching. And some of the decisions they've made over the last time give one a lot of hope, especially the high courts. I mean, the the Court of Appeal before it all goes down to the Supreme Court. So it's something that we need to watch. I don't think it's out there. One of the other things that I think is an important one is definitely very, very quickly for devolution to continue to proceed. I think classification of roles and the financing around those roles is required. Some of these are constitutionally determined, but the financing is basically a political question. So again, Kenya's legislature needs to separate, especially the National Assembly needs to separate itself from the executive and begin to perform its oversight and functions a little bit more. They haven't performed so well so far because the legislature has behaved, especially the National Assembly, as if it's an appendage of the executive. The final one is completely a bit unrelated, but is important for Kenya's democracy going forward, is the Public Benefits Organizations Law, and new amendments are required. To be honest, they wouldn't necessarily affect an institution as the IEA because we are registered in a separate regime, but some of the things that are being sneaked into that law and the amendments that are properly coming, they really require watching. One, because it seeks to constrain what kind of resources and how public benefits organizations, which is basically NGOs in general, would receive and how they'd perform their functions. I think it is patently unconstitutional, but that this can actually be considered within Kenya's legislature with the kind of constitution that we have is part of the constitutional growth journey, in my view. But it's worth really, really watching. And I think it's placed Kenya's CSOs in general in a place where part of the strategic options that they have is strategic litigation in relation to what clarifying the roles and the powers and the rights that have been provided under Kenya's constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today about Kenya. So my name is Vukasin Petrovic, and I'm Director for Africa Programs with Freedom House. In order to understand the trends in Kenya and in order to understand the current dynamics and where Kenya is at the moment, for a moment we have to take a step back and just take a look at the trends across the continent. Trends in sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to political rights and civil liberties. And as you probably know, one of the things that we at Freedom House do is that every year we publish a survey of political rights and civil liberties in each and every country in the world, including all countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So according to our survey, Freedom in the World, in 2013, in sub-Saharan Africa, we had 20 not free countries, 19 partly free, and just 10 free countries. That is classification, general classification that we do. And this is the first time that we have this number of countries after 1995. So effectively, the same number of not free and free countries in sub-Saharan Africa is now as in 1995. Effectively, if we are just to look from that perspective, nothing has changed in the last 20 years in terms of state of human rights and democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. And what is very worrying for us is the negative trend. It's not just that the state is the same as in 1995, but we are seeing continuous degradation of fundamental freedoms across the continent. When we are talking about issues such as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, political participation, and pluralism, all of those, how we treat them as fundamental freedoms, have deteriorated in more than 25 countries. So more than 50% of the countries are experiencing declines in these fundamental categories of freedom. And actually, East Africa is the worst sub-region in the continent. And compared to West Africa and Southern Africa, it's really mind-blowing. It's really interesting how two of the regions in sub-Saharan Africa are able to perform very well, and then East Africa as a separate sub-region to perform so poorly. In fact, in 2013, there was not a single free country in East Africa. And from 12 countries, 5 were partly free and 7 were not free. And again, out of these 12 countries, 7 were in decline, while just 2 were improving. So overall, very negative trend that is led in the first place by countries such as Ethiopia, Uganda, and Sudan. But having said that, it's not that Kenya's performance was any better. Kenya ranks as a partly free country, and it's actually in the very middle of that partly free category, and it's surrounded with countries such as Burkina Faso, Niger, Madagascar, as countries that are performing better than Kenya, and then followed by countries such as Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, or Burundi. So in that sense, it's definitely not Kenya's performance compared to other countries in the region is nothing special. And again, what worries us looking at the trends in Kenya is that Kenya had the biggest decline of all non-conflict countries in sub-Saharan Africa last year. Just Central African Republic and South Sudan experienced bigger declines. And Kenya, together with Zambia and Uganda, are the countries with the biggest declines, Kenya topping all of these. And one, again, worrying trend is that Kenya is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa that experienced a term that I just coined today, double-dip democratic recession. So effectively, in the last year, the only country that went through the crisis, succeeded to get out of it, and then went back into it again. So for us, and from a pessimistic point of view, the question is actually Kenya going to become a 21st not free country, and how fast it's going, how fast that could happen. If you take an example of Ethiopia, who was a very well-performing country up to 2005, it took them less than 5 years to become from a country that was promising and that was where we were seeing significant advances of fundamental freedoms to become an example of a closed society. And if we want to go and try to look at some of the reasons why we are so pessimistic. Firstly, and again, we are talking about both, I would say, regional trends or some of the major causes that influence developments and trends in the region, but then also trends that are very characteristic for Kenya itself. And one of the major causes is actually hold on to power at any cost. And if you see in Kenya, political culture didn't change. And still, politics is a good business, and people go into politics in order to be served, not to serve their people. Also, again, 2013 elections were somewhat disputed, or result of 2013 election was somewhat disputed. And again, as in many other countries in the region, we have already seen some of the undue influence on on other organs of the state. Second thing, or second big consequence of current state is that actually these days is much more beneficial to be in power than at any time before in the history of Africa. With the unprecedented economic growth, including Kenyan unprecedented economic growth, being in power allows access and control of money. And as we know, one of the biggest problems in Kenya is corruption. And again, corruption is a not new problem. It's there for a very long time, and it still troubles and undermines accountability or undermines quality of governance in Kenya. I think that one of the most striking facts is that the actual GDP of Kenya could be 50% higher than it is now if there was no corruption, informal economy, and bad economic policies. And politics in Kenya is still very ethnic-based. And again, in 2013 elections, people didn't vote for a candidate of their choice. People voted based on their primal fears, and they voted for candidates of their ethnic origins in order to be protected, or to feel that they will be protected if their person gets in power. And as I will mention just a little bit later, that the fact that elections were peaceful doesn't mean that suddenly all of causes for post-electoral violence in 2007 have been resolved. And as a matter of fact, that ethnic tension still remains and underlines, I would say, political reality of Kenya today. Other important factor is that despite representation and despite free and fair elections, again, due to the fact that political culture didn't change, people and the people's needs are still not represented. And the MPs and governors and most of other people that are working in administration do not necessarily promote public interest, but their political or their self-interest. And what we are hearing and seeing in Kenya is very big disillusion with political system, with political elites as such, which just tends to increase potential for further violence. And when it comes to Kenya, again, there is substantial lack of political alternatives or of alternatives at all. As we know, both Uhuru and Odinga, these are not their first elections. And as a matter of fact, if we want like that, they are both part of Kenyan political royalty, being sons of first president and first vice president of Kenya, and both running in different times for presidential elections. We should not forget that Uhuru was Moi's protege in 2002 elections, and that he lost those elections to Kibaki. So in that sense, the very same people are on the political scene for a very long time. Also, political parties do not differ in terms of political programs or their ideology that they are presenting. And for example, in 2013, there was very little to differentiate between Odinga and Uhuru. And again, alliances that are created, or political alliances that are created around elections, are ethnic-based, not issue or ideology-based. And just one more time to, again, say that what we have seen in 2013, and again, what is very worrying is while elections were peaceful, ethnic tensions remain. Underlying causes of violence are not resolved. And the question is when and what is going to spark those ethnic tensions, and again, the continuation of, or again, big violence and internal conflict in Kenya. And a actually, this was, I suppose, Kenya was the first place where we could identify terror of peace as a trend. And again, in a run-up to elections last year and after elections, everyone was so worried that will spark ethnic violence. So there was a lot of self-censorship. And that actually debate in a run-up and in post-election period was not as rich nor vibrant as it should be, because of a significant amount of self-censorship on part of everyone, media, civil society, political parties, which again just didn't contribute to stabilizing democracy in Kenya as a, let's say, as an institution. Now, on top of that, we have Uhuru Kenyatta's and his authoritarian tendencies. And for us, the first problem in Kenya is that actually Uhuru himself put Kenya's future into dispute by presenting himself at the elections while facing very serious charges, such as ICC charges. He actually put himself in the front of Kenya or his nation, without thinking what actually might mean for Kenya as a country, that he as a president is going to face potential trial and charges. Again, for us, it shows those of I would say, lack of conscience and importance and understanding of what the role of the president of one country means. And even before the elections, Uhuru and Jubilee Coalition have shown strongman tendencies. In their manifesto, they announced how they will deal with civil society organizations and how they will try to regulate political campaigning, how they call it, of civil society organizations. So everything that was happening by the end of last year in terms of introducing amendments to Public Benefit Organization Act should not be surprised, because that was announced at the very beginning of Uhuru's and Jubilee's campaign period. Of course, vilification of the West, I will not spend too much time of it. Uhuru promotes narrative of accusing West of colonial practices and influencing internal events in Kenya. But at the same time, and what is very actually boring for us, it's vilification of civil society. And again, as I said, from the very beginning, during the pre-election campaign, Uhuru and the Jubilee Coalition started creating this narrative of civil society as evil society, as rent seekers, as someone who promotes and works for political interests and supports Western countries' agenda, rather than as someone who works for public interest and works to contribute to the well-being of the country. Throughout this now almost actually whole year, at no point Uhuru or his administration actually acknowledged role that civil society played throughout history in economic, social, and political development of Kenya as a country. I will not talk too much about decentralization, but what we are seeing is effectively an attempt to control decentralization process and effectively to exercise exclusive oversight and power over over counties and to exercise exclusive power over counties and governors. And actually, as one of my colleagues who was last week in Mombasa at the event organized by governors said that governors were saying how only thing that central government wants is to see them fail. And ultimately, what Uhuru has done in this year is working and taking very much what Ethiopia and Ethiopian government have mastered over the last, let's say, 10 years in closing the space and try to implement it in practice. So we are definitely seeing closing of operating space for civil society and media. Public Benefit Organization Act is just one attempt to curb that space and to put the limit on foreign funding. But in addition to that, we have seen and heard threats to civil society organizations, threats to human rights activists, especially those who are popular and those who can draw attention to the issues. We have seen several protests that were crashed by police, activists arrested, charged with several different, based on several different laws. But also what we are seeing, and closing of space never comes in one way, or closing of space is usually done by combination of different laws. So public benefit organization was one attempt. We have seen that they succeeded in pushing with amendments to information and communication bills and effectively introduce or legalizing libel and proposing huge fines for journalists and media. And something that we have seen in the last couple of days, and that is more and more talk about using anti-terrorism legislation against civil society organizations. And I think that even in the last couple of days, we heard calls from different people in the government and MPs that government should investigate different NGOs and their support to terrorist activities. So if we take use of information or media bills, civil society legislations, and anti-terrorism bill, that is exactly 3 laws that Ethiopian government uses to control the space and to effectively fight any dissent. Now, if we want to think about what is necessary going forward and what is the key going forward, ensuring accountability of political elites and different political structures in Kenya is the key. And I would say this is the key at all levels, starting from the local level, starting from then going to governors and then to National Assembly and the president itself. Without being able to without being able to hold those that hold office accountable for what they are doing, we will not see any genuine improvement or a reversal of trends in Kenya. But in order to be able for civil society and other stakeholders to hold government accountable for what they are doing, there must be demand for reforms. And involving citizens and ensuring citizens' participation in different civil society activities or political processes in Kenya is the key. Without citizens demonstrating their demand and demonstrating what is that they want and what is that it's their interest, it will be impossible for, as I said, civil society or other stakeholders to hold effectively government and other institutions accountable for what they are doing. And I have to stress the key in ensuring accountability is engagement with the government and engagement with the different institutions of the state. At the same time, democracy in Kenya needs its champions. So first and foremost, civil society that we are focusing very much on needs to nurture and have leaders who are both accountable for their own actions and ethical in way in which they are going about their business, without showing on their own examples that accountability is what is important without them being democratic themselves. They will not be able to give an example of how other leaders should behave. Taking back the role of moral authority, and it goes back again that civil society organizations, if they want to be influential and if they want to be held as important stakeholders, they must ensure that they are working in public interest. They must ensure that what they are representing is what our people needs. And then that will allow them to help people also to understand what is right and what is wrong, and to help them navigate through political, I would say, events, future political events. Having said that, civil society cannot do this on its own. And ensuring that businesses and business people are involved and understand importance of democracy. Ensuring that governors and all those progressive office holders or those MPs and people from the executive, that they all understand what is the benefit of having a democratic system, and making sure that there is a cooperation between all these sectors and between all these people from different spheres of society. And all that because Kenya is actually not just another African country. Kenya is key for stability and advance of freedom in East Africa. How we see a situation in East Africa, Kenya is the only country likely or with the biggest potential in the near future to promote good governance and democracy beyond its borders. And it's influential both politically and economically, and its civil society is also so well connected with civil society in the region and can contribute to improvement of human rights situation in neighboring countries such as South Sudan, even Ethiopia and Uganda. And I would say because of that, if we are comparing Kenya with other countries, we should not compare Kenya with Uganda or Ethiopia. Kenya should be held to higher standards, and we should compare it with countries such as South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, both Vukasin and Kwame. I think those were two very compelling presentations. Kwame talking about the challenges that devolution faces, and very concerning. And I dare say Vukasin's presentation was virtually alarming and sort of describing what's at stake in Kenya. So I guess if you can come back up front here and we can take some questions. I think starting out here with John, and then
Kwame, I want to thank you. Kwame, I want to thank you for your very nuanced presentation. But I want to ask you about a specific bill. I think I'm sure you're aware of this. A couple of MPs proposing on cost grounds, cutting back the number of counties from 47 to 10. Pardon me? And reducing the size of the chamber from, I think it's 190 to 140, cutting out the women's representatives. Okay, and I mean, the crossing seems like a fig leaf for a frontal assault on devolution. And I wanted to ask you if you think this kind of thing has legs. This is where it's really going. Too late.
Well, I think let me start with the fact that Kenya is where it is regarding the number of representatives that we have because of a political compromise that was made when the constitution was brought to the fore. So at that point, yes, a few lapses here and there led to the design that was too elaborate. Among them was a requirement for the one-third rule, where the one-third rule requires that no specific institution or representative body in Kenya should have more than one-third of a single gender. I think it was brought in good faith. Its intention was to ensure that there's balance, so that if fewer women are represented, or rather are elected, then what you have is an additional one. So there's like what we call the gender penalty. If Kenyans fail to elect sufficient women, then we pay for it in extra taxes to ensure that chambers are balanced. Entirely understandable. I didn't think that the majority for youth was necessary, because that's also been brought in for the Senate and all these other bodies. Well, the youth are majority anyway. I think 60% of Kenyans are below the age of 35. So if they want to, they should elect their own. But anyway, it was expanded in such a way that, yes, representation, people argue there's over-representation. I agree. The timing, however, is what you're questioning, and whether that's in good faith. It's difficult to tell whether there is, but I think my view is that that's not a door we can open now. I think it's closed about that. It also comes at the wrong time, partly because there's very clear present and clear danger about people within the bureaucracy first, and within representative bodies who are frustrated with the extreme independence of certain governors, and obviously certain arms of government as well. So there's a question that is it going to save money? And it's not. So let me go on a limb and spend another minute to tell you, if Kenya really wants to save money, there's an institution that has to be reformed. Public sector wages are a problem. There's no doubt about that. One of those is that the Constitution of Kenya, and one thing that Kenyans were particularly obsessed about and particularly hostile to, is something called the provincial administration, which exists within the office of the president. The Constitution specifically requires under Schedule 4 for it to be, Schedule 3 for it to be reformed. It says reformed. What the administration did, not this present administration, but President Kibaki's administration did, was instead went around and renamed them, so that we have what are provincial commissioners are now called county commissioners, and they've been sprayed all over, without proper tasks, in my view. And it's a huge facility with people who want a lot of money, fairly competent for most of them, but it has no space in the new constitutional order. So someone has to bail the cat and say, look, we have to reform this thing, which basically means mostly cutting it off. That's a difficult political discussion. And it's difficult for any incumbent to start, partly because these support certain functions of government in one way or the other, and they served a political purpose, which was mostly security and stuff like that. So it's a very difficult one to have. I think this is a young government. It should start it, in my view, but whether it will start it is a different matter altogether. Not to mention that there are incumbents who now serve in various purposes, who have seen their career path from the provincial administration and are definitely completely enamored to it and will not want for it to be done. But those are difficult decisions, but they have to be made. The provincial administration in Kenya is redundant. I'll state that completely straight away. But whether it will be reformed is one of the difficult questions. I think it will probably end up ultimately in the Supreme Court. Somebody will actually just go down there and make a supreme decision. But those are the political choices that need to be made. So you're right.
I'm Dong Gamokoli. I'm a professor at Marymount Industrial University. In many sub-Saharan African countries, until recently, 1990s, the traditional authority used to play a key role. Now my question is, what place does the national authority occupy in the kind of the changes in Kenya? A new constitution, devolution, and talking about these ethnic conflicts that gentleman just pointed out, do you see the traditional authority involved in this conflict? And if so, what can be done with that authority to have it to play a key role in governance and the politics of Kenya in these days and in the future? And the last question, you compare Kenya with South Africa, that Kenya should be compared with South Africa. And you also mentioned it is the worst, East Africa. Now, how do you compare East Africa with Central Africa, where a country like Congo, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country like South African Republic, how do you compare? And how can the East be the worst, while in the Central you see even the worst of the worst? Thank you.
Okay, do you want to take? Okay, so let me start by answering to your, actually Central Africa and the Eastern Horn of Africa are on par. So Central Africa, amazingly, has one free country, while East Africa has none. So in terms of their performance, they're very similar. They're on par. Difference is very, very minimal. But again, what I'm trying to say is that does East Africa want to compare itself with Central Africa, where you said you have Congo and you have many other very, very dysfunctional countries, or countries that are under dictatorships for a very long time, not to mention Obiang or in or Cameroon and Biya, which are two of the longest standing presidents in Africa. But to just one more time try to go back to your question. So it's very similar in performance to Central Africa. Having said that, again, as I said, I think that especially in the case of Kenya is the country that should not compare itself with Central Africa, but South Africa as an example of a big country, economic, both political and economic power, and then at the same time country that compared to the rest of the continent when it comes to its democratic practices performs the best. So that is I would say to answer to one of your questions. I will start answering about ethnic conflict, and then I can give it to you. Problem that we are again seeing, in order to prevent ethnic conflict, one firstly has to go back and do properly the whole reconciliation process and address everything that happened in 2007 and 2008 in terms of violence, and then to go back even further in the history. Now the question is how you can do that when you have both your president and vice president very interested in that debate and that process not taking place in a genuine manner. And when you have both of them actually willing to manipulate further that ethnic tensions in order to remain in power after this, after next elections. I don't know if you want to.
Authority, and Kenya's case is different because Kenya did not have very well, when the British left and even when the British arrived, Kenya did not have very well established traditional kingdoms and structured. So we haven't had a history of them. Nevertheless, I'm very cautious about what we call traditional authority because they are hostile to youth, they are hostile to women's rights, and generally very conservative and extremely cruel. So the new constitution has no time for them, to be honest, which is a good thing, largely. I mean, given our neighborhood, traditional authority, in Kenya's case, I don't think there's much. Whether there's a possibility for other informal mechanisms to use for the purposes of building peace and reconciliation, I think that a chance does exist. And one of the things that this new constitution, rather, after the 2007 conflict and obviously Kofi Annan's intermediation, one of the things that came about under Agenda 4 was to build a Truth and Reconciliation, Truth Justice Commission, which went about, did a full report, was presented to President Kenyatta sometime last year, soon after his ascension to office, and we've had nothing of it again. So I think it's about getting back to that report and using it. I have no time, to be honest, for traditional authority in the continent from which I come. I think often they're more trouble than they're worth. And in Kenya, definitely we haven't had a superstructure for them, and I wouldn't want to put them into this. Comparison of this, I understand, I think it's true that when you look at some of Kenya's, even Kenya's political culture, and you try to compare it to the rest of the region, I mean, Kenya has used to have, until the last elections, Kenya used to have a developing country press, and a very, rather, more or less almost a middle-income country press, even developed country press, and developing country incomes. So that has not happened. To be honest, I think the Kenya's press needs to wake up, and I think they may be responsible for some of the scores that we saw here. I have stuff to say about some of those scores, but they may be responsible for that because they became cheerleaders for a regime, and in many ways actually left outside some difficult things that happened, including about the elections itself, and including about certain things that actually the country needed to get into. And so yes, in addition to what you talked about, I think one of the things that the major memes that went about social media last year was the peace lobotomy, which was Kenyans deciding to completely not debate difficult things that could have been done, and with a new administration that was sprightly, perhaps much younger, obviously, than their predecessor. I think the youngest team we've ever had since Kenya's independence, to confront these issues that should have been done. It did not happen. And Kenya's press was kowtowing to the administration in such a bad way that when the new bills came in, they were actually shocked. So they're trying to get their way back, but it won't be easy because Kenyans, many Kenyans, dispassionate Kenyans, saw them as part of leading to the washing away of the independence that they should have had.
Right. And sorry, just to go back to add one more thing, and what is the major difference between East Africa and Central Africa, and that is that in East Africa, you have 4 out of 10 biggest economies in sub-Saharan Africa. So you're Kenya, you're Tanzania, you're Uganda, and okay, still to a certain extent, despite all economic difficulties, Sudan are all members of top 10 economies. And if you want like that, you know, there is much more fertile ground for socioeconomic and political development in East Africa than in Central Africa, where in most of the cases you have very poor countries, with an exception of Equatorial Guinea. No, because again, West Africa, which is a combination of Francophone and Anglophone countries, is the best performing region. And again, both Anglophone and Francophone countries in West Africa perform much better, or most of them perform much better than any other countries in other regions.
Another round of questions. I see the man here and the woman here and then the woman over here.
Hi, I'm Jordan Street. I'm with Search for Common Ground, the Africa team there. And my question is to do with the politically incited violence since devolution. So there have been lots of reports on trends emerging, especially in northwestern Kenya, of politicians inciting violence to achieve electoral gains, to kind of territorialize ethnicity, to create kind of a homogeneous electoral basis. You know, big events such as the Baragoi massacre, there are a lot of reports on kind of interference by politicians. And then recently in other counties, there's been lots of reports of governors, you know, or senators using certain techniques to achieve gains. So my question is about the role of civil society organizations and just what role you see what role they have in curbing this trend and whether they actually have the capacity to do that.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Schmerman. I work with the Africa Division for the International Republican Institute. My question is to Kwame. I was wondering if you could expand some of your comments about the recent tensions we've seen between the national government, the National Assembly, and the Senate, and the county government, and if you think that this national debate on the public wage bill, if you could elaborate a little bit on your thoughts on whether or not that may be used as a tool to kind of squash the power of the county governments, and relatedly, how, in your opinion, can the very real problems and issues of corruption at the county level be addressed while simultaneously addressing lack of funding and resources to do what they've been mandated to do? Could you speak to that? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Sloboda from the International Budget Partnership, and I wanted to ask Kwame if you could speak about the issue of public participation, because there are a lot of spaces and formal mechanisms provided for public participation, particularly in planning and budgeting processes under the Public Finance Management Act and the Constitution. And I know that initially there was very low awareness among the public of these new provisions and these spaces that they now have. And I was wondering if you could speak about whether you've seen an increase in the level of awareness among citizens of these public spaces for participation in planning and budgeting, and also actual involvement of citizens in these spaces, as well as not just citizens, but maybe more local civil society organizations in counties, because I know at the national level there's quite high awareness. Thank you.
Civil society, county government, and public participation. Kwame, do you want to?
Or you want to start with this? Okay. Look, so I will actually try also to answer to your question partially, because what is the problem both with the engagement of civil society at the local level as well as the national level is governments or Uhuru's government insistence that civil society should not be supported by any donors. And it's my understanding that, for example, a big devolution program that is supposed to be supported by all major donors, and that would both help supply and demand side, is on hold, and as of today very unlikely to happen, because Uhuru's administration doesn't allow civil society, both at the national or local level, to benefit in any way from that program. So we can talk about, what is in books there in terms of what is allowed in terms of participation, but as we are hearing and as we are seeing at the moment, Uhuru's administration is not willing to allow any of that, or at least it's not allow support to civil society organizations to participate in any of that. And that goes back, I would say, also to the question of how equipped local civil society organizations are to mitigate potential conflict or to work on conflict resolution on a local level. I would, in the first place, let my colleagues to speak more about their capacity. I will not go into it. I would say, in the first place, it's important to ensure that they are allowed to do that, because with decentralization of power, we can also talk about decentralization of violence, and you pointed out about all incidents that happen. And I think that's one of the additional problems in Kenya, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that majority of counties are actually ethnically mixed. And therefore that it's likely that governors would prefer ethnic group or tribe that they are coming from, and that they voted them into the office.
Okay, let me start with the the question about northwestern Kenya. Let's remember that the problem in Baragoi took place before the election of the present administration. So it was a problem that, it's a security problem and something that you should have dealt with. It's not clear to me that it was necessarily related to elections. I suspect, though, that it was related to, actually know that it was related to cattle rustling, which is basically the security and stuff like that. And one of the things that it reflects is people thinking that security forces who are on the ground are not necessarily fair. So it reflects security policy seen as reflecting preference for one group against the other, or bias against one or the other. So this one group then decides to act unilaterally to actually prevent that. And a number of policemen who actually had gone to claim and to actually conduct some surveillance and some investigation then died. A formal report has not been issued, but I think what the press covered and what the members of parliament at that point talked about was just basically that, yes, the police getting into the crossfire because one group or the other sees them as necessarily affiliated to the other and not acting impartially. The main problem in northwestern Kenya right now, I think one issue that perhaps we didn't talk about but could complicate devolution as well, is the discovery of petroleum resources in the northwest of Kenya, and specifically in an area which had been marginalized. We call it marginalized in Kenyan lingo, which means basically government resources and public services were not available to these people to a large extent. And so, because of the expectations that an extraction of petroleum would yield, one sees local expectations going really high, and some kind of what I'd say, some kind of concern about the fact that, look, foreigners will come in here, a few people will get jobs, and we are not getting jobs. And there was one of the facilities in that place by an extracting company was actually marooned a while back out of the claim. Look, we don't have jobs from the local people here. How comes it's everybody else? So that's one other delicate thing that requires competence on both the part of the national government and the county government that worries me. And I think it's a question that we should be looking forward to. The role of civil society, of course, in also ensuring that you downplay the big expectations that everybody has, which may lead to disappointments, and one of the others is a different matter. So the Northwest, definitely. The other security question is, you all know after Westgate, which is basically this bad, I think, again, it reflects, a report came out from, was presented to the legislature. Of course, the National Assembly rejected it. After it's one committee within the Assembly did, it was presented to the other, it was rejected. I think one of the things it reflects is the possibility, and if you have a content analysis of Kenya's papers, the possibility of xenophobic attacks or some kind of posture against Kenyans of Somali origin and in general Somalis who are refugees within the country. It's not a good thing. It's not a good sign in general, out of the belief and I think this overplay of jingoism. It's almost becoming, if you analyze Kenya's media content and all that, it's as if jingoism is something to be proud about, one person trying to be more patriotic than the other. I call them the patriotic police. There's more forceful expression of, in some ways, of course, completely empty-headed, but the view that you're a patriot and defending a given kind of people against others is one that I think also needs to be watched about. And it's even causing, within the main coalition, some tensions between coalition leaders. So that's one that I see as a problem. In my view, it is completely related to the discussion that Kenya has not started about Kenya's stepping into Somalia. I did not think it was a good idea then. I do not think it's a good idea today. But who's going to bell the cat and start the discussion? Kenya's forces have no business being in Somalia if the Somali people do not appreciate it, and if it is going to actually lead to something else here. I think we need that discussion in Kenya's case as well. The tensions between the National Assembly and the Senate and the county government, yes, these tensions tend to be, in my view, driven by specific circumstances. I think right now governors are isolated. Remember that governors are elected in the same constituency that senators are. So they're direct competitors in one way or the other. in as much as governors only have term limits. The only offices that have term limits in Kenya is the president and the governors. And so most governors can only serve for 2 terms, and obviously will be out. The senators, for some reason, perceive a threat, and are therefore trying to bring in laws together with the National Assembly that force senators to sit in certain committees within the counties, which obviously governors are unwilling to countenance. Because of that, there's some kind of ganging up between the legislature, both the Senate and the National Assembly, to try and, in their view, cut down the governors to size, with very odd constitutional results. Many of these laws actually will be struck down as soon as people begin to go to court. So I think that's one other thing. The question about the wage bill. Let me state here, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, some of the work that we do, supported by some of our partners were here, is basically to actually review and to ensure that there is public participation and to prove that public participation matters for budget policy. And we recognize those numbers every year. I will tell you this, for every $1, according to official publications, for every $1 produced, or rather of revenues in Kenya, of expenditure in Kenya, 55. For every $100, $55 are used in paying for salaries directly. Wages, directly. Now that is not a sustainable one. Again, we reviewed some data over the last 7 years. This is not a creation, I have to be conscious here, this is not a creation of President Kenyatta's administration. It is largely a creation of the last administration and the makeup of Kenya's public sector. So the last administration kicked the ball in. It landed on President Kenyatta's lap. Together with the establishment of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, this problem has to be solved. It's one of the big public sector reform questions in Kenya today. It has to be solved. President Kenyatta's initial reaction was to take a 20% wage cut on his own wages, which, as the Institute of Economic Affairs said, look, this is a symbolic gesture, but symbolism is not policy. So he has to provide political cover to the Salaries and Remuneration Commission to ensure that when she proposes a cut in allowances in Kenya, which is part of the bigger deal, there are people who want, say, by way of example, $100 in Kenya, but their allowances for travel and everything else actually triples that amount every month. So the problem is not on the side of the wages per se, it is on the side of the allowances. Now, when the Salaries and Remuneration Commission brings in a policy to settle this, the president needs to give them political cover with members of parliament and his own administration. That is required. That is policy, not a 10% or 20% wage cut. That is what is wrong. So the question is real, that it could be leveraged against, politically against county assemblies and also against governors, is real. That too is possible. But sitting at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we know this is a problem. Why? Because wage bill has been growing, growth in the wage bill has been growing at much higher rates than even the revenues itself. Something is going to give at one point or the other, and it has to be confronted right now. Finally, public participation. Yes, I mean, county governments are new, and I must say that even with the best of circumstances, even if Kenya was the most peaceful country in the world, we've had 50 years of a very centralized system of government. Decentralization was going to be messy one way or the other, even with the best of circumstances. So yes, I think many Kenyans, because of the centralized level, the groups in Nairobi and CSOs in Nairobi are very adept at reaching government, putting forward representations one way or the other, finding out about meetings, calling people and making sure they appear for meetings. Now, the quality of the representation is a different matter altogether, but at least they know what's happening and they can get in there. It's not been like that at the country levels, given that countries are very different. But if you measure by one qualitative measure, when you go to county offices, by 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, you have people lining up to see the governors and the county assemblies. Nobody lining up at the provincial administration's part. So for some reason there's demand. It may not be unstructured, it may be unstructured, but there's demand for people to actually have some representation and to basically speak to the people who make decisions for the provision of public services at the local levels. So I see that as a good thing. Some kind of training, some kind of facilitation will be necessary for competent groups to begin to work at the county levels and to do this on a continuous basis. But I think it's still early days and there's some hope. Thanks.
And sorry, if I can just add one quick sentence, just to support what you said. huge projects such as decentralization, the whole reform takes up to 20 years, or it can take up to 20 years if there is political will. But if, as we are seeing now, there is a lot of obstruction to such an important process such as decentralization, we are talking about the ultimate failure of decentralization or even prolonging of that very long period during which this reform takes place.
Well, I must say, I found the discussion this afternoon to be incredibly insightful, and I learned a lot. And I have a feeling that there would be a lot more questions, but we have run out of time. And so, with that, I just want to thank you, Kwame and Vukasin. Thank all of you for coming this afternoon, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.